Well, I've been working on my new miter saw station, and I wanted to start another project, not related to this, but what I wanted to use was the plywood that I use in this right here. I made this for my old chop saw station. It was a zero clearance type fence, and it won't work on this new arrangement, and I'm not going to take the time to make it work. I've come up with a different idea, and it starts with a zero clearance insert that goes in the slot that's here in the saw. And I'll just quickly go through how I made it. The first thing that I did was to remove the green plastic inserts so that I can slightly modify them. And while they were off, it's a good opportunity to vacuum out the dust and stuff that gets down inside there. The modification that I need to do is just to cut a small notch at the end of each piece, and I'm just going to grind that away on my small belt sander. And then I can screw the pieces back in, and you can see the wider slot at the end. I already measured the width for the insert, which is 1/2 inch, but now I have to measure the depth and make sure it's the same all the way across. Rather than doing this, these green plastic inserts can be moved closer together, but then that leaves a gap on the other side of them, and that'll fill up with dust, so I think this way is a lot better. Now that I've got the piece cut, I can check the depth again by putting it in there, and I can see that it gets higher near the fence of the saw, so I need to mark and cut that so that it'll fit in there properly. To keep the end of the wooden insert from lifting up, I want to add tabs that fit right into the slot I made in the green plastic inserts. Now I made this to fit right into the gap between these two green pieces. It fits down inside, and then you slide it ahead to lock it in place. I haven't cut the slot in it yet because I haven't used it yet. Now, under normal circumstances, you really don't need this thing in here. The open gap underneath is not really going to have an effect for most cutting operations. It's only when you want to make a very clean cut, say in a piece of trim or something like that. There is one other component that has to go with this, and it fills this gap in at the back of the fence. And it just slides right in, and it fits snugly over that part of the saw. So this one works for 90 degrees only. If you want to change the saw to 45 degrees, you need a different one. And that's the one that I'm going to make in this video. So if we look at the one I've already made, the first piece that I'm going to make for this 45 degree one is the part that fills up that gap between the two fences. So I've got a piece that's 3 inches tall. I'm just going to hold it in place and then draw the outline of the fence on the back. And now I'm going to make those cuts with the scroll saw. Okay, well that's going to fit in between the two fences and completely fill the gap, but it can't go in straight like this. When the piece comes out or goes in, it has to follow that 45 degree angle that this piece is on, because the part that I'm going to make next fits on over this, and that's what locks it in place. So I've got to remove material at the back here, and I'm going to do that with the table saw. So I've got my table saw blade raised up about 1 inch, and that should cut the right angle on the front of this so it clears as it goes in. Before I go any further, I just want to say that anytime you're freehand cutting on the table saw, there is some risk. If you're not comfortable doing this, there are other ways. You can cut this with a coping saw, or grind it down with a sander, or even use files, whatever slower method or less interesting method than cutting it here on the table saw that works for you. Okay, so the idea is that this is going to slide straight out on 45. If you need to, you can fine-tune it with a file a little bit as needed. It doesn't have to be a perfect fit in around the fence here. It can be a little sloppy. The main thing is that it can slide straight out and it won't get hung up on this side of the fence over here. That's the important one. The next thing that I need to do is measure the thickness of this piece right here. I already know what it is because I already made the other one, and it's 1 inch exactly. You really want this to be a snug fit on there though, so maybe making it just a hair under 1 inch would be great. And then that way, if you have a piece that's a little bit too tight, you can always sand it down on the inside so that it's a better fit over that. Now, my saw is made this way and it has this, but you can look at your own saw and try to adapt the idea to yours. The concept here is to make 2 of these The first one that I made that was 90 degrees, the other one is 45 degrees. At this angle, I'm not going to bother making it at the other angle. I find that whenever I'm making or cutting molding or at 45 degrees, I'm only cutting it with one setting on the saw for both ends. Back here at the table saw, I've got my mini table saw sled put on. I've got a block of hardwood that I cut to 1 inch thick. And what I want to do is nibble away some of the material on the end so that I'm left with a piece that fits right underneath the part that hangs down on my saw. So that first piece was a test to get the depth right. Put that aside. I recut another piece that fits in there perfectly. And that's important. You really want this to be a snug fit underneath that. It keeps it from lifting up. When you have something that's just friction fit in a saw like this, you really want to make sure that it's secure. The force that's being applied here is the blade cutting this way. So if it's pushing it in that way, it just tightens it up. This part was easy for the 90-degree one, but it's a little bit trickier for the 45-degree one. I put the hardwood block in so that it's tight up against the thing there. Now I'm going to use a piece of plywood to mark the front of the fence, and then I'll be able to use a piece of plywood cut at 45 degrees to mark where I need to cut this one off at 45 degrees. Okay, now I can try it out to make sure it's the right size. I'll just slip it in, and then I'll put the fence in place and see if it's flush with the saw's fence. Okay, that doesn't look too bad at all. Now's the time to make adjustments to this piece. This supports the back of the insert, and it really needs to go up tight against it and fit well. If you make a mistake here, just make a new piece. This is the critical part right here. So that goes in, this goes in against it, and then there's going to be plywood parts that go in beside it, and I'm going to make those next. Okay, these pieces of plywood are 1/2 inch again. I've already cut the ends to 45 degrees so they'll meet this fence correctly. I've cut them to length so that they'll fit in here. The idea is that they need to snugly fit around this part that sticks out. I've got another problem here. This needs to slide out, and if you can see, this plywood, the bottom edge of it will hit this fence as it comes out. So I need to mark it so that I can make a notch in it so that it clears that fence. The same thing will happen over on this side, except it's not as much. Now that I've got those 2 plywood parts ready, I can glue it onto the hardwood block. I want to make sure that it's flush along the front here and use plenty of glue. There won't be any mechanical fasteners anywhere in this to cut through with the saw. If you're not confident in the glue, which you really should be because it's actually makes a stronger bond than the wood itself when it's face grain to face grain, you can put dowels in after it's glued together, and that will add mechanical strength to the joint. Well, I let the glue dry for about 2 hours. I already tried it. It was a little tight. I had to sand a little bit off on my belt sander on the inside. And what I'm looking for here is a nice snug fit when it slides on. So that slides in right tight up against the plastic part that hangs down there. Now I've got the fence, and I'm going to try that in place and see how that looks. And it's pretty flush with the face here. I've got a way to adjust this afterwards, and I'll show that a bit later. But before I do that, I want to get this glued on to the part that I've already made here. I could use regular wood glue for that, but regular wood glue doesn't work as well for end grain as it does for face grain. So I'm going to use epoxy for extra strength. So I've got some epoxy mixed up here, and all I'm going to do is put it on the face of the part that fits inside there. And then I'm going to push the fence up against it, and I'm just going to leave it there without any clamps. I do have a strip of tape underneath there to catch any epoxy if it leaks out. Now, I'm not going to clamp it, but I am going to put a heavy object. I've got my sledgehammer here and a piece of wood to wedge up against it, and that'll just hold it in place until the epoxy sets. I mentioned that this can be adjusted So you're really better off to make sure that your fence is a little bit behind the fence that's on your saw so that you can push it forwards or adjust it forwards. Here I've got the original, or the 90-degree one, and I've added a block of hardwood to the top here. And you can see in the end here, I've got a screw in the end of the hardwood, and that will go up against the part on the saw there, so you can push it in and out by adjusting this screw. So that strip of hardwood needs to be 1 inch wide and about 3/8 of an inch thick. So I'll cut that here on the table saw. Then I can glue that right on top of the 45-degree angle one and let that dry as well. Now the glue dried on the hardwood piece, I added to it, and that goes up against that metal part right there when it goes in. But to make adjustments, I'm going to put a screw in. Just going to take my drill and drill a pilot hole and then drive the screw in, not all the way, and then I'll try it and see how deep it is, and then I can make adjustments from there. Okay, well that looks pretty good. It's lined up with the fence here really well. It doesn't move around, which is good. A note about this is that you really have to pay attention to the way this is put in there and the way this is made. Depending on your saw, it really should have a point up high on it that it bears right back against some solid part of the frame, because the forces, like I said before, are going to push it this way. The last thing you want is for the saw blade to hook this thing up and get it jammed in there somehow. Okay, well as you can see, it works well, and when I don't need it, all I need is pull it out, and then I can take it and put it up inside the cabinet. By the way, a lot easier to store than that other bigger one. And if I want to change the 90 degrees, I've got my 90-degree one here. Over the 90, slip this one in, and then I can make the cut. Now I haven't used this one yet, so it'll be the first cut. It's probably worth mentioning that the one thing that you don't want to do when you have one of these in is try to change the angle. That will not work well. So take it out, then change the angle, whatever you want, and go from there. You take your thing, put it up on the shelf. Anyway, that's it for this one. If you want more details, there's a link in the description to the website article I wrote about this. Also, see my new miter saw station. I'm making a series of videos on my other channel. And there's also a link in the description to those if you'd like to check that out.